Joy tried to jump back in, but Aldean didn't rush, and that was the moment that changed everything. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the interruption fall flat, then continued in the same steady voice. He explained that he had spent his life writing songs about people he knew, towns he grew up in, and emotions that didn't fit neatly into talk show sound bites. He wasn't there to argue, he said, but he also wasn't there to be talked over. The way he framed it wasn't defensive, it was deliberate, like someone finally deciding to draw a clear line after years of being misunderstood. Joy smiled, that familiar half-grin she used when she sensed pushback, and countered with a comment about influence and responsibility. The camera cut briefly to the audience, some nodding, others stiff and unsure. Aldean listened without rolling his eyes or raising his voice. When she finished, he leaned back slightly and said that responsibility goes both ways, that artists shouldn't be expected to carry the weight of every political interpretation others place on their work. His words weren't flashy, but they were sharp in their clarity, and that clarity made them hard to dismiss. The exchange began to feel less like a typical TV debate and more like a clash of perspectives that had been building for years beyond that studio. Aldean talked about being labeled without being asked, about headlines forming opinions before conversations ever happened. He spoke about fans who came up to him at shows, not to talk politics, but to say a song helped them through a hard night or reminded them of home. Those stories grounded his argument, pulling it away from abstract talking points and into something human and tangible. Joy attempted to redirect, mentioning criticism he had faced online, suggesting that silence could be interpreted as agreement. Aldean nodded, acknowledging the point, but then calmly turned it around. He said silence can also mean refusing to play a game designed to provoke outrage rather than understanding. He admitted he didn't always have the perfect words in the moment, but that didn't mean he didn't think deeply about what he stood for. The audience reaction grew louder, a mix of applause and murmurs that signaled the conversation was hitting nerves on both sides. As the minutes passed, it became clear this wasn't going the way Joy had expected. Her questions became shorter, more pointed, while Aldean's answers stayed measured and expansive. He wasn't trying to win a viral moment, he was explaining himself in full sentences, refusing to be boxed into a headline. That refusal itself felt like a shutdown, not loud or explosive in volume, but powerful in its restraint. There was a moment when Joy tried to interrupt again, and Aldean gently raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to ask for space. The gesture surprised everyone, including Joy. He smiled briefly and said he respected her perspective, but asked for the same respect in return. The studio went quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small movement feel amplified. Even the host's desk lights seemed brighter under the tension. Aldean then spoke about division, how conversations had become performances rather than exchanges. He said people tune in expecting conflict, but rarely leave with understanding. He wasn't accusing, just observing, and that made it harder to argue against. He explained that shutting someone down doesn't always look like yelling, sometimes it looks like refusing to be pulled into chaos. His voice never wavered, and that steadiness carried more force than any raised tone could have. Joy leaned back, clearly reassessing, and for a brief moment the sharpness faded. She acknowledged that he was more thoughtful than some of the portrayals suggested. It wasn't a full concession, but it was a shift. Aldean nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement without pushing for more. That balance, standing firm without pressing too hard, further tilted the moment in his favor. The audience applause grew stronger, less divided now, responding not to a side but to the authenticity of the exchange. Aldean wrapped up his point by saying he believed in conversations where people actually listen, even when they disagree. He added that music, at its best, brings people together, not because it forces agreement, but because it reminds people of shared feelings. It was a simple closing thought, but it landed with weight. As the segment edged toward its end, Joy thanked him, her tone noticeably calmer. The cameras pulled back, but the energy lingered. Viewers could feel they had witnessed something different, not a shouting match, but a moment where calm conviction cut through interruption and assumption. By the time the show moved on, it was clear that Aldean hadn't needed to dominate the conversation to shut it down. He had done it by staying grounded, by refusing to be rushed or reduced, and by turning what was meant to be a confrontation into a controlled, unmistakable statement of who he was. When the cameras finally cut and the studio lights dimmed slightly, the tension didn't vanish, it transformed. Crew members moved with practiced efficiency, but there was a subtle buzz in the air, the kind that follows a moment everyone knows will be replayed, clipped, and debated. Jason Aldean stood up from his chair and adjusted his jacket, exchanging polite nods with the staff. Joy Behar gathered her notes, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. Whatever had just happened hadn't followed the usual script, and both of them knew it. Backstage, Aldean was approached by a producer who thanked him for keeping the conversation respectful. He smiled and said that respect was the whole point. He wasn't interested in winning an argument on television, he explained, only in making sure his words were his own. As he walked down the hallway, snippets of conversation floated behind him, staffers whispering about how calm he'd stayed, how the energy in the room had shifted. He didn't slow down to listen. For him, the moment was already done, filed away as another experience in a long career shaped by public scrutiny. Out in the real world, though, the moment was just beginning. Clips spread within minutes. Social media lit up with reactions from every angle. Some praised Aldean for his composure, calling it a masterclass in staying grounded under pressure. Others defended Joy, arguing that tough questions were part of the job. But even among disagreement, there was a surprising amount of acknowledgement that something different had occurred. This hadn't been a shouting match or a walk-off. It had been a quiet power shift, and that made it harder to dismiss. Fans shared their own stories in comment sections, echoing Aldean's words about music and meaning. They talked about songs that played during long drives, during breakups, during moments when life felt uncertain. For them, his calm response felt personal, like he had spoken not just for himself, but for anyone tired of being reduced to a stereotype. The debate moved beyond the show and into broader conversations about how public figures are expected to perform their beliefs rather than explain them. Joy Behar, for her part, addressed the segment later with a tone that surprised many. She didn't double down or mock the exchange. Instead, she acknowledged that conversations like that were complicated, especially when emotions and assumptions run high. She maintained her perspective but admitted that Aldean had articulated his point more thoughtfully than the headlines suggested. It wasn't an apology, but it was a recognition, and that recognition added another layer to the moment's impact. Aldean returned to his tour schedule, stepping back onto stages where the noise was louder but the expectations were simpler. Night after night, he looked out at crowds singing along, people from different backgrounds united by melodies they all knew. He didn't mention the show directly, but there was a subtle shift in how he spoke between songs. He talked more openly about listening, about understanding where people come from without needing to agree. The applause that followed felt deeper, more connected, as if the audience understood the subtext without needing it spelled out. Media outlets continued to dissect the clash, some framing it as a shutdown, others as a rare moment of mutual restraint. Pundits argued over who had won, missing the point that there hadn't really been a winner in the traditional sense. The real takeaway was the contrast between expectation and execution. Viewers had tuned in expecting sparks and sound bites. What they got was patience, and that patience lingered longer than outrage ever could. Weeks later, the clip was still circulating, resurfacing whenever discussions about discourse and media came up. It became a reference point, not because of a dramatic outburst, but because of what hadn't happened. No one had stormed off. No voices had been raised. Instead, one person had refused to be rushed, and in doing so, had quietly taken control of the moment. That kind of control doesn't fade quickly. For Aldean, the experience reinforced something he had always believed but rarely articulated so clearly. Being heard doesn't require being loud. Standing your ground doesn't mean standing on someone else. The explosive part of the clash wasn't the volume or the anger, it was the way expectations were flipped. A setting designed for confrontation became a space for clarity, if only briefly. As time passed, the conversation around the segment softened. It became less about sides and more about style. Teachers referenced it when talking about communication. Commentators pointed to it as an example of how to respond under pressure. Even people who disagreed with Aldean's views admitted that his approach had been effective. That admission, reluctant or not, was perhaps the clearest sign that the moment had landed. In the end, what remained wasn't the sharpness of Joy's questions or the intensity of the studio lights, but the image of a man sitting calmly in his chair, choosing his words with care, and refusing to be pulled into chaos. That image stood in contrast to the noise of modern debate, and because of that contrast, it stayed with people. The clash faded from headlines, but the lesson lingered, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful way to shut down a moment is not with force, but with steady, unwavering calm.